So, welcome to the Food for Sustainability and Grow webinar on the Europe carbon farming journey. My name is Luís Martins, and I'm the service director at Food for Sustainability, and I have the pleasure to be guiding you through this exciting discussion for the next 1 hour and a half. I need to advise you from the house rules that our webinars are recorded, so please keep your cameras off if you don't wish to appear on the recording, and the questions are very welcome, and our speakers are totally available to discuss with you and answer your questions. So the questions can be put in the final of each speaker presentations through the chat or Slido, a platform that we'll present in the following minutes. At the end of all presentations, if there is time, I will do a short roundtable and an open discussion of these awesome speakers and the audience. Today, we embark on a deep dive into the innovation strategies, challenge, and the success shaping Europe efforts to mitigate the climate change through the agriculture. We follow the previous discussion to know more about the carbon mitigation potential through the Europe and how this is being shaped at the farm, at the national and European level. We'll cover some aspects from regenerative agriculture practices to policy frameworks. So stay with us to navigate together the opportunity and the complexities in your path towards to the sustainable agriculture future. And with us and joining the debate, we have the pleasure to be joined by the three experts who will share with known expertise, knowledge, and I'm sure that the passion about the decarbonization of Europe. So, I would like to introduce you to Henrique Voysey. Henrique Voysey is serving as a Chief Impact Officer at SoilCapital for over 10 years. Andrew is at the forefront of accelerating regenerative agriculture and advancing global net zero initiatives. His health of experience and dedication to climate farming practices make him the key voice today in this discussion. And the second speaker will be Mathieu Mal, that is representing the European Environmental Bureau. Mathieu is an advocate for environmental friendly and socially policies within the European, with a strong focus on actionable strategies to combat the climate change. And the Matthew's contributions are instrumental in driving meaningful changing within the European landscape. And finally, Henrique Cerqueira. Henrique is currently pursuing his PhD and will share his experience as a teacher in environmental and global change, with hands-on and the knowledge on carbon sequestration tools in agriculture. He brings invaluable insights into the intersection of agriculture and the environmental stewardship. So I would like again to the speakers to be present on our webinar, and I hope you are ready to delve into the forefront of sustainable agriculture climate action. So let's ignite the inspiration and collaboration to make real the contribution of this carbon farming journey. So we'll start with a Slido platform. So we'd like to challenge you about some questions, some curiosities that about the carbon sequestration, and Rita will start to present the platform. So we can join the platform through websites and slido.com. You can put slido.com, and the open in the tab, you have to put F4S Academy, or you can join the Slido by the cell phone through if you read the QR code. Okay. So I hope you can join this platform. It's very good to know and know about the curiosities of these related with this webinar.
Yeah.
Okay, so we
I
can
think I
wait.
can start.
Okay, thank you.
Let's
Thank you, Rita. And when you join the platform, we will go to the Q&A and polls. And now, since Henrique started the poll, now you can active votes on these questions. So the first one, researchers state that improved soil and land management through, for example, reduced till, more organic matter, water efficiency, for example, could result in the potential of offsets. And what is the percentage of global greenhouse gases emissions? So, okay, you can vote um, in this question, and of course is this number is the number. I know the answer. Yeah, and of course we need to improve these values. So I can give you a tip. Improving soils would also create a host additional benefits, including ecosystem services, making a win-win according to the scientists of Institute for Global Food Safety at the Queen's University of Belfast, one of the partners in the group. And the answer, Rita, we can make it appears, and the right answer is 5 to 10% is the result of the potential offset of the greenhouse gases emissions when we are improving the soil and using land management, more sustainable practices on that. Okay, so we can move to the second question, and this is also a very nice a curiosity for all of them and all of you. And in the surface area, the equivalent of the soccer football field. So we can assume more or less an hectare. 1 hectare. Soil microorganisms process how many kilograms of organic matter? And this is very interesting question. And of course, the micro and macroorganisms are have very different capacities, and we depend them to our our life, and the job in the agriculture is very important. And as you mentioned, okay, we can wait a little bit more, only 13 questions, but I can share with you that is a lot of kilograms. So, okay, very nice, Rita. Yeah, it is 25,000 kilograms. So 25 tons of the organic matter that can be processed in the 1 hectare, for example, by the organisms in the soil. So we depend on them, and we have to protect and regenerate and create them all the suitable soil and micro environment to carry out of these missions. So the next question, and this question will be addressed by the first speaker. In case the Andrew will speak about a little bit about this, and which emission scope generally related to the both emissions from the upstream, so contributes to the most greenhouse gases emissions. So, okay, maybe the people are totally maybe aligned. Scope 1 and scope 3. So, what is the right answer? I don't know, yes, is the scope 3 emission, other indirect emissions related to both emissions from the upstream and downstream business activities. And these scope 3 emissions are usually far larger than the two others. However, these emissions are complicated to measure. So when when we are contributing to the global neutrality or the net zero emissions, corporates needs to specify this with which scopes of considering and ensure full transparency. So, and take advantage of this question, uh, I will give the floors to our first speaker, and I can introduce Henrique Voysey from SoilCapital. And Andrew, if you would like to start your, okay. Andrew is again is a chief impact officer at the SoilCapital, the agronomy firm that launched regenerative agriculture transition program, certifying its climate impact in 2020. Andrew led the development of this program, so-called SoilCapital Carbon, which has more than 1,600 farmers. The program is designed to enable food and beverage firms to deliver improved Scope 3 reductions. Is on the supervisory board of Cool Farm Alliance and a strategic advisor to the Sustainable Soil Alliance and in UK. Prior to SoilCapital, Andrew spent a decade building sustainable finance practices at the University of Cambridge, an Institute for Sustainability Leadership. During this time, he led several industry collaborations between the finance and the food and farming sectors. He is also an advisor on the climate change to the Bank of England. So thank you so much, Andrew. The floor is yours, and please.
Thank you, Luis. Just to confirm, first of all, you hear me well and you see my slides.
Very well, thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Luis, for the introduction and to the Food for Sustainability team's invite to join you today. And I really enjoyed the questions that started this session because it highlights the contribution that regenerative agriculture can make, not just to global climate change, but to other ecosystem services as well. And it begs the question, I suppose, how? How do we get farmers to adopt different practices in a way that can deliver 5 to 10% of those global greenhouse gas emissions reductions and removals quickly? And the great opportunity with farming is that actually compared to some of the other decarbonisation opportunities we have, it can be done relatively quickly. So I'm going to share in my presentation today our experience of how we have been doing this in practice and share some insights that we've picked up on the way. So just to introduce SoilCapital in more detail, we are an agronomy firm. As Luis says, we work today with over 1,600 farmers, but we have a history over the last 10 years of starting as a pure advisory firm, working with farmers on the ground, helping them to transition their practices. And then over time, starting to support industry groups and cooperatives. So Cultivaye there is a Belgian cooperative working to deliver regenerative produce to market. We launched our regenerative agriculture program, SoilCapital Carbon, in 2019, and we've been developing experience ever since then across the industry. The farmers that we work with today are in Belgium, France, and the UK, and they are producing a range of arable crops, cereals, oil seeds, proteins and legumes, as well as root crops. And we are working with them to improve fundamentally their soil health. Why? Because it delivers so many multiple benefits, as Luis said. We can improve the nutrient density of our food. We can help to restore the water cycle, using soil to both absorb water when there's too much and give resilience to crops when there's too little. We can at the same time increase biodiversity and reverse the biodiversity collapse that is happening worldwide. And of course, the reason we're talking about this, in the process, we can sequester more carbon in our farmland soils. So the point here is that we take a very holistic view of soil health, not just a narrow focus on carbon. And the way that we do this overall is to connect farmers with companies that are committed to rebalancing our agricultural system. So food and beverage companies within the value chain that have ambitious commitments for sourcing regenerative produce, or they have science-based targets committing them to climate action, which, as we heard from the Slido question, will often have them focusing on their scope 3 or supply chain impacts, which is, of course, where the farmers sit. And what we're doing is connecting those companies with the farmers that they ultimately rely on to build resilient and regenerative supply chains. The soil on the left is visibly different from the soil on the right. The soil on the left has extremely low organic matter, extremely low carbon, which is why it is lighter in color. And on the right, we have a more healthy soil that is sequestering and holding more carbon, holding more water, supporting more microorganisms. And ultimately that translates into the resilience of crop yields that these food and beverage companies and society depend on, especially as we are subjected to more and more extreme weather. The connection between these two groups, the companies and the farmers, is ultimately financial reward. So as I've told you, we're working with over 1,600 farmers in 3 countries. And at the end of the day, these companies are paying farmers for the emissions reductions and soil carbon removals that they're achieving. And they're doing that because they recognize the value that is being created, and they recognize the risks that farmers are taking when they're changing their fundamental management practices. Without that new value exchange, we will not see the adoption of regenerative agriculture at scale, because it will be seen as too much of a risk by too many farmers. So we've already verified 150,000 tons of emissions reductions and removals. We are about to add to that with several 100,000 more tons in the next few weeks. And we're projecting significant growth over the next 3 years. And so now what I want to do is start to share some of our insights from having run this program for the last 3 or 4 years. And the first one is the most important. A lot of initiatives, projects, programs that try to engage farmers with changing their management practices take a very prescriptive approach. They tell farmers exactly what to do or what not to do. And our opinion, our view as an agronomy firm that knows the farmer mindset very well, is that that doesn't work. Farmers already operate with lots of constraints and they face lots of risk, and adding to that does not help. So in our program, we focus on the outcomes. The outcomes are across soil health, biodiversity, water, and carbon. And it is those outcomes that attract financial reward. The farmer is left in control of how to achieve those outcomes, of course, with some boundaries. And this graph starts to show you what kind of impact is seen as a result. So each of the lines on this graph, each of the vertical lines, is a single farm, and the line is representing the greenhouse gas balance of that farm. On every farm, you have sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and you have sources of removals, soil carbon sequestration. And you have to add those together to get the balance, the net effect. If the net effect is overall net emissions, the line is red. If the overall effect is net sequestration, the line is green. And what you're seeing here is the very first cohort of farmers, about 100 of them, that we recruited back in 2020 into our program. And you can see through the animation their greenhouse gas balance over time, year 0 through to year 2. And what you see is two things. Firstly, there is a general shift towards the left. Fewer red bars, more green bars. Overall, on average, everybody is improving within a few years. And what you also see is that even if a farm is already performing rather well, there is still room for further improvement. And so the proportion of green continues. And we wondered when we first saw these results, was this an accident? Was this just the first 100 pioneers that we recruited? And so here is the same graph for the second cohort, the following year. There's about 400 farmers here, which is why there's less space between the bars. But you can see the same pattern across 2 years, year 0 and year 1. The red is decreasing, the green is increasing. Everybody is transitioning on average from right to left. When we look behind that data, there are many regenerative practices that farmers can be adopting to influence their greenhouse gas balance. And we've started to analyze the removals, the carbon removals that are being quantified in those previous graphs, and where are they coming from? And we do this because we want to know how much of a systems view are farmers taking to changing their practices. And the answer is quite encouraging. More than 75% of the carbon removals that are being seen here are generated on fields where at least 2, sometimes 3, different regenerative practices are happening at the same time. So we're talking there about reducing tillage, we're talking there about increasing cover crops, and we're talking there about adding more organic fertilization to the soil. And so in 75% of cases, we're seeing at least 2, if not 3, of those practices being adopted. There is an adoption curve, however, and these 3 graphs are showing that on the left, farmers typically find it easier to start by reducing the intensity of their tillage, their cultivations. So 50% of the farms in those charts have gone to reduced tillage on 100% of their land. What comes next is the introduction of cover cropping. So 50% of the farmers have adopted cover cropping across 57% of their farm area. And then last but not least is the organic fertilization, where 50% of the farms are applying organic fertilizer across 30% of their land. And we could talk maybe in the Q&A about why that adoption curve makes sense from an agronomic point of view. But it's interesting to see with fairly significant numbers, this is 500 farmers, some clear trends emerging. And so just as I wrap up, I want to move away from carbon and now just mention that we are now measuring multiple outcomes from regenerative agriculture beyond just carbon. So we're now measuring the impact that these practices are having on water, on soil health, on biodiversity, and importantly also on farm economics, because we want to bring some objectivity to the whole transition. But we want to do that in a way that we don't overwhelm the farmers with more data collection requirements. So we are using only the data that we need for their carbon assessments, and adding to that resources from third-party platforms and satellite imagery in order to come up with indicators that can be used in a range of other proprietary frameworks for understanding soil health improvements and regenerative agriculture more generally. And the results there are equally encouraging, that the trends move in the right direction. So to sum up, I'm trying to answer here the question, how can we take advantage of this opportunity to improve soil health and sequester carbon? And I'm arguing that actually we should focus on allowing farmers to do what they do best, to do the farming. We should focus on mobilizing the money that they need to take the risk of changing practices. And we should target that money on the results that the farmers achieve, not tell them what to do. We see that this can work. It works because you leave farmers in control, which is what they need, as long as we have appropriate safeguards in place to make sure they are focused on the right kinds of activities. Of course, they need appropriate support in terms of knowledge and technical assistance. And our data shows that the results can not only be relatively fast, but they can also be agronomically appropriate. Multiple practices changing at once, delivering multiple co-benefits. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions now or indeed later during wider discussion.
Thank you so much, Henrique. Very inspiring, informative presentation. I guess it's very important to the farmers in the house and this webinar to look for this kind of approach and the value that this kind of firms, companies that are totally aligned with the farmers and the work that they are currently doing in the daily work, and protect them and give them some support to take care of our soil and take care of our ecosystems, because it's very important to have this work on that. I have two different questions that I would like to address. If there is no ones on the chat, please, audience, if you'd like, please put in the chat or in the slide. But I can start on that. The first question, Henry, you shown in the slide 3, you shown the work done in Belgium, France, and the UK. Which are the main difference between these 3 countries regarding the carbon farming interest and the approach to the farmers? Because we spot that France have a lot of a huge area, I guess, more clients to SoilCapital clients, but what are the main difference and ideas behind the farmers? Can you explore?
Yeah, so obviously you have differences in climate and soil type, and therefore what is grown and when. That's normal. You have differences in farm structures and farm sizes. The average farm in Belgium is much smaller than the average farm in France, which is much smaller than the average farm in the UK. That changes the economics of how attractive or not our program is. And there are also broader differences, I think, in terms of the market context. The French have been promoting the idea of carbon farming, at least for some time. The government has a standard around it, the label bas carbone, which has helped to normalize the topic. You don't see that, for instance, in the UK, where there's therefore been a lot more hesitancy around this whole new area, because there haven't been so many authority figures normalizing it. So, there's lots of different things to consider. And one of the questions in the Slido is, how do you get in touch with such a large number of farmers in just a few years?
Yeah,
I mean, exactly. I can answer that directly, but everything I've just described has to be taken into account. Farm size, the economics, the opportunities given the soil type, etc. We've done a lot of work to reach out to farmers directly. We are an agronomy firm by background. We have large networks. We know how to speak to farmers. So we go to farmer events. We have a sales team that deals directly with farmers. But I think the other major explanation is that we work within the value chain. We partner with cooperatives, with aggregators, with processors, with consumer packaged goods companies who all have their own networks of farmers and have the trust of those farmers. So we get brought in by those partners and we benefit from their trusted networks.
Yeah, totally agree with you. And the network and the trust across the value chain is very, very important, and de-risk the actions of the farmers, of course, and support them to start this transition. And also FRS are trying to doing also this through different supporting and financial programs. Just also a question that for me it's important also to understand regarding the score that you give in the score that you give to the farm. You mentioned 5 parameters, and according to different countries and situations, the parameters will have different weights. So,
yes,
for example, you understand? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. That I didn't spend a lot of time explaining the score, but the underlying scale is grounded in a scientific understanding of the local context. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, make totally sense. Yeah, because for example, the organic matter in Portugal is different in the UK and Central Europe, and this is very good. Thank you so much, Henrique. Voysey. If anyone in the audience would like to make a question, please make in the chat or in the Slido. So we'll move to the next speaker, Mathieu Mal. Mathieu Mal will present a Climate-Agri policy in Europe and the role of carbon removals. So in complement of the message from Henrique, and Mathieu is in the role of European Environmental Bureau, Europe's largest network environmental citizens organizations. Mathieu Mal focuses on the UA policy on the intersection of climate and agriculture. He is based in Brussels and engaged with policymakers, politicians, civil society organizations, and other stakeholders at UA and member state level. He leads in the formulation of European Environmental Bureau policy and strategy on agriculture and climate, coordinates the policy work on the European Research Project on carbon farming, and it is a member of the European Commission expert on the carbon removal. Previously, Mathieu worked on the land-based climate change mitigation at Stockholm University Institute at the Asia Regional Office in Bangkok. Thank you so much, Mathieu. So the floor is yours, and welcome to be present with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. A couple of disclaimers first. My computer crashed just 5 minutes ago, so I hope that doesn't happen again. If I disappear, then that's what has happened. And second, as you've mentioned in your introduction, but I think it's good to stress it again, I work for the European Environmental Bureau, which really does sound like an EU institution, but it's not. So we are an umbrella network organization for environmental civil society organizations. So all of our member organizations, about 190 of them, are environmental NGOs. So not representing the EU institutions here, but I do work on EU policy. And so what I wanted to do today is to give a bit of an overview, quite high level, because of course we don't have an endless amount of time to go into detail, but on a couple of topics that are currently very, I'd say, relevant in the Climate-Agri space, which is what I focus on in my work. at the EU level, at the EU policy level. And so I will try to walk us through some information on the 2040 climate targets, the carbon removals certification framework, the Agri ETS, and then hopefully some time for questions and answers. So first, starting from the very, kind of high level, but I think it's good to mention it because when we talk about carbon farming, that's one element in a strategy for achieving our climate goals, which includes emission reductions, but also emission removals. So the sequestration of carbon. It can be land-based in our soils. It can be industrial with, for example, direct air capture and storage in aquifers. So there's different ways of doing that. But so in February, the European Commission published a communication on the 2040 climate targets. A communication means it's a suggestion for the next commission. It's not a binding text. So this is not a binding target. What the current commission suggests is for by 2040 to aim for a minus 90% net greenhouse gas emissions. And the net is really important there because it means that you take into account the removals as well. So they say by 2040, we want emissions to be at this level and we want to compensate this amount of emissions with this amount of removals. I think the slides will probably be shared after the meeting to all participants. So there's a couple of links in there if you want to go and look at the documents. But what I really want to get to is this part where I hope you can see this. I hope the graphs are not too small. By 2050, we will have some residual emissions from certain sectors where it's difficult to reduce those emissions. They're called hard to abate emissions. And the darker yellow that you see on the pictures there, that's the agriculture sector, because in agriculture we're working with nature and there will be a certain level of emissions left in any case. So actually by 2050, the agriculture sector is projected to be the largest emitter in Europe. And we have a legally binding target in the European climate law to be climate neutral by 2050, which means that if we have emissions still, it means also we need negative emissions. And those negative emissions, as I mentioned, they can be either land-based, which is the green bar that you see below the x-axis, or they can be industrial emission removals, which is the red part that you see. And so these 2040 climate targets communications, they came with an impact assessment where modeling is done on different scenarios. So if you apply different sets of measures with different levels of ambitions, that's what you see on S1, S2, S3. For the agricultural sector, that means all technical fixes, let's say things like precision agriculture, feed additives, those kind of interventions at different levels. The life scenario, which you can see drops emissions faster than all other scenarios, is a scenario that also takes into account, for example, dietary changes, so changes on demand side, and it also, I don't know how many will be familiar with the farm to fork strategy, which is kind of the flagship overall policy framework that the EU Commission presented as part of the EU Green Deal for a more sustainable food system. So this life scenario assumes that all of those policies are implemented as it was intended, but we know now that is not the case across the board. And you see that the goal is climate neutral by 2050, and there's different trajectories to get there. But main point is removals have a role there, and so that's where carbon farming comes in as well. And going on to the CRCF, which is a very new policy, it's a framework that we got since April. We officially have a provisional agreement because it still needs to pass through the European Council. And so this is a quite broad framework. It includes many different things, as you can see here on the graphic. Carbon farming is the one we're talking about today, so it's what I'll be focusing on. But just for your knowledge, it's a part of a bigger picture, right? It's part of a bigger picture in which we remove carbon from the atmosphere, which also can be done through carbon storage in products, or it can be the permanent carbon removals that I mentioned before. If you look at the boxes under carbon farming, you will see that it says soil emission reduction and carbon farming sequestration unit. That's a bit confusing because for something called a carbon removal certification framework, you would think it's about removals, but also it includes a little bit of emission reductions. More specifically, when you re-wet peatlands, in first instance, you reduce emissions from those peatlands. And also, if you make more efficient use of fertilizers, you reduce those emissions. So that's also included. And then you have the carbon farming sequestration unit. So that's basically everything that Andrew has been talking about just earlier. So these are some of to make it a bit more concrete, but I think Andrew gave a very practical examples already. This is what we're talking about. These are potentially activities that could be certified as removing carbon from the atmosphere. And so the whole idea is that we have a methodology, an EU-approved methodology for certifying these removals and emission reductions, so that some kind of unit can be created. That unit can then be certified with a kind of EU stamp of approval. It will be, of course, audited by third-party verification bodies. It needs to adhere to certain criteria called the quality criteria, which stands for quantification, additionality, liability, sustainability. Specifically for carbon farming activities, there is a mandatory biodiversity criteria. That's something also Andrew already mentioned in his presentation. There is a risk sometimes if we talk about climate and focus on carbon that we get this carbon tunnel vision, only look at carbon. It's important to have a holistic mindset. Whether the CRCF achieves to do that is still to be seen, but at least for carbon farming, there is a mandatory biodiversity criteria. And so the idea is that all of these credits, they will be generated, all these certified units, they will be put in an EU registry for these credits that will be publicly accessible. Yeah. So that's kind of the process through which these units that will be generated will go. So as I said, I don't represent an EU institution, so it's okay for me to be critical and ask some questions about the developments as well. It's too much to cover everything really, but there are a lot of questions. The first one, as I've mentioned, is this risk of focusing on carbon and forgetting about the rest. The risk of looking at certain practices in isolation, which probably is not what we need to shift to more sustainable food systems, right? We cannot just add cover crops to a conventional agricultural field. Well, we can do that, and it's often being done, but it doesn't mean that suddenly we have a sustainable food system. So we fear that maybe focusing on just carbon farming may actually hamper the development towards a more holistic and a more fundamental change in how our food systems work. I'll skip to maybe the last bullet point there, being mindful of time and leaving maybe more space for questions. Or maybe let me jump to the fourth one first about the use case. The whole process of setting up the CRCF has been quite agnostic about what we will actually be doing with those certificates. So CRCF says the methodology for creating those certificates, but it doesn't say what needs to be done with it. What we have now as information is that all the certificates generated, all the units need to count towards the EU and NDC, so the overall EU climate commitments, and they can be traded on the voluntary carbon market. That's what we have so far. For 2026, there will be a review already. So that's, it hasn't really properly started yet. In 2026, we already know there will be a review. And then further in the future, it's possible that there will be a compliance market, which means that it's not only voluntary anymore to purchase these credits, but might become compliance, so mandatory. And that's why I want to talk about the Agri ETS in a bit. The final bullet, I think, really gets to the crux of it. We want a transition towards more sustainable food systems. The question about whether the CRCF, at least also in its current stage, where it will be a voluntary instrument, the question of whether that will be enough to drive this transition, will that be able to fund a stable and kind of large-scale transition? That's still a question. It will depend on many things: how popular the scheme will be, how burdensome it is being perceived as, or how large the incentive will be, because it's a market mechanism. So we don't set the price; the market will set the price. So will it be successful as a finance mechanism, but at the same time, will it be successful as a climate or an environmental tool? And that will depend on the environmental safeguards that we set. How well do we prevent a focus on carbon and these isolated activities that may have other negative effects? How do we regulate the claims that companies that buy these credits make? If a company buys these credits and says we contribute to more sustainable farming, that's one thing. If a company buys these credits and says now we are a carbon neutral company because we offset our emissions with soil sequestration, that's something completely different. The first question on the slide, I believe, was how much can soil offset from global emissions? We as an environmental organization are not so fond of the offsetting logic, because we don't believe that you can offset a fossil fuel emission with a land sequestration unit. Those two are not fungible, they're not equivalent. So we need to make sure that we do our very best at reducing emissions, and at the same time also try to restore nature, have better soil management, and to store carbon that way as well. So yeah, it's still to be seen, in our opinion, whether this tool will be successful at financing and combating climate change. I'll go quickly through this as well, but I just want to highlight it because I think it's in the broader context of the discussion around food systems, and this is food for sustainability. Something that's really big potentially that is coming up on the EU policy stage is the discussion around the Agri ETS, which has already started. And so an ETS is an emission trading system, and that's what we have for all other sectors. Pretty much from 2027, all other sectors will be covered by that, which means that there is a price on emissions. And the way that an ETS works is that you cap emissions at a certain level. You say this is the maximum amount of emissions overall, and then some operators that emit more need to buy credits, allowances from other operators that emit less. So a cap and trade system is an ETS. And so there has been a report from the European Court of Auditors saying, well, in agriculture, actually emissions are not being paid by anyone. They're negative externalities that nobody has any responsibility over, and that's kind of strange because all other sectors have this as a cost that is allocated to someone somewhere. And so that recommendation or that observation started a process in the Commission of looking at how could we implement this polluters pay principle to agriculture. And they launched the first study on what an ETS for agriculture could look like. It's very early stage in terms of exploring what it could look like. But this is from that study, what came out of that is that there's different options. So the question of where to put the points of obligation. So who are the actors that will be be held responsible for emissions from agriculture? And there was another question from the slide, so it was quite nice to see those questions. I can link back to them. There was about Scope 3 emissions, right? Being actually the main source of emissions in most situations, and that's why an Agri ETS could be something positive, because instead of relying only on farmers to address emissions from farming, it's recognizing that actually other actors in the farming, like the agricultural value chain, also have a role to play in reducing emissions. So that's why they look into an upstream ETS. For example, you could hold feed and fertilizer companies accountable for the emissions down the line. There's also options for, of course, the on-farm ETS, where farmers are the actors being regulated for their emissions. Within that option, you have multiple choices again, whether you want to do it for all farms, for all greenhouse gases, or you want to look only at really significant polluters such as livestock farms, or farms that are operating on peatlands, so drained organic soils which emit a lot of greenhouse gases. Or downstream ETS, do we look at food processors to be held accountable for those emissions? So that's just to give you a very quick insight into what is being discussed there. That was part 1 of that study. Part 2 of the study comes back really to carbon farming and carbon removal. So part 2 looks at how could we potentially integrate removals in that picture. And there that means that it could potentially be one way. When I talked about CRCF, I said we don't really know what those credits will be used for, except for maybe voluntary carbon market. Here, it opens the door to potentially using these credits in a compliance setting, so that companies, for example, to offset their Scope 3 emissions, will have to buy these carbon farming credits. So that's one possibility, which, as I mentioned before, depending on how it's designed, could be problematic, because then you could have an incentive for companies to purchase removals which are cheaper than reducing their own emissions. And there, as I mentioned, we should have separate targets for those emission reductions and removals. Another way to do it, which would prevent this potential issue, is that the revenue generated through the system by companies buying allowances and reducing their emissions could be used to fund the carbon farming activities in a way that they're decoupled, and so they don't count towards the company's emission reduction target. Yes, also for the Agri-ETS, we have some reflections, but I think in the context of this conversation here today, I think the top one will be the most relevant. Will the removals be included in a system where you risk reducing slowing down emission reduction efforts, or will they be kept separate? I think that's the most relevant question. For carbon removals or carbon farming, then of course you see the host of other questions that are still to be addressed at this very early stage of the Agri-ETS discussions. That's it. Thank you. I hope I didn't take too much time, and that we still have some time for question and discussion.
Thank you so much, Matthew. No, it's totally on time, and very interesting presentation with all policy and the data involved on that to assess and visualize all the information and what is going on in the near future, considering the ETS, but also the carbon farming. I have some question also related with ones that is in the slide. We can complement Rita if you'd like to put the ones, but Matthew, regarding the certification framework for carbon farming, carbon storage, and permanent carbon removals, do you think that will create a positive impact and help the governments in the strategic decisions about agriculture and forestry policies design in the short term? So if they can influence the design, for example, the structure or the agriculture policies, the agriculture, for example, eco schemes, what do you think they can contribute to for these strategic decisions, and also as said in the slides of what the impact in the government laws?
Yes. So how the role of farmers to influence these the development of these policies, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. I think we've been through quite special times in the agricultural policy world with the farmers' protests over the past couple of months, which, to be honest, were a bit of a symptom of something that's of course been going on much longer. And I think as the EEB, we do support we do sympathize with, and we do support a lot of the asks from farmers, specifically that it should be possible to have a dignified life and good life standard from farming, and that comes first and foremost from a fair price for what you produce. I think that's where we see the current agricultural system really, or food system really failing. What I'm a bit worried about is that something as carbon farming, which with all the good intentions, of course, it has to improve agricultural practices. It sometimes by some actors is being presented as an income stream that will help farmers, but I do not believe that it can. I do not believe that it can replace a more profound shift of how we set up our food systems. And I think that's something that a lot of farmers' organizations are making very clear as well. For example, there is Via Campesina, that is a farmers organization representing smallholder farmers, and there is IFOAM Organics Europe, which is representing the organic farmers at the EU level, and they make this very clear. Their demands to policymakers is not to backtrack on environmental measures, as what we have seen with the latest changes to the common agricultural policy, where the Commission says, okay, farmers, we hear you, and we are going to make your lives easier. So we drop some environmental requirements. And these organizations have made very clear that's not what we're asking for. We're asking for trade practices that are fair and food prices that are fair, so that our farmers can have an income and do the kind of farming that they would like to do if they had the means to do it. And I think those are incredibly important voices to be heard, and they should be really, what we try to do is also amplify these voices, because they represent the type of farming that we believe can make this sector resilient, unlike the conventional agribusiness kind of farming.
Yeah, totally. Completely agree with you, Matthew, because and it is very important to have these kind of organizations to also to protect and be on the right side of the farmers and give their value to the work. And this question, for example, is there already any list recognized carbon certification schemes by European Commission? Do you know?
Yeah.
Can you give some examples?
Yeah, so I know when the answer is no. There's no list yet. So what is it's a good question, because it's really that's the way how it will work indeed. So what the CRCF what the framework doesn't do is it doesn't make its own scheme, right? So you won't be certified by a European Commission scheme. What it does is it sets a framework with certain criteria, and then existing schemes or new schemes can apply to be recognized under that scheme. But since it's not operational yet, and the stage we're currently at is that there is an expert group on carbon removals that is leading on the development of methodologies. And so each practice will have its own methodology. So there will be a certification methodology for the rewetting of peatlands. There will be a certification methodology for agroforestry. There will be one for no tillage. And so all of these methodologies are still being drafted now. We expect to have the first draft methodologies by the end of this year. And so until we have these very specifics of which criteria does each methodology need to follow, we cannot yet say which existing schemes will be meeting those requirements. So we're not at that stage yet.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you so much for your presentation and these answers. Now we have to move on. We'll have our last but not least speaker. I would like to introduce you the Henrique Cerqueira. And Henrique will present about the carbon sequestration and ecosystem services in the left bank of Guadiana River. Henrique Cerqueira is a geographer specializing in the environmental and natural resources and their relationship with land use and occupation. He was a founder of university spin-off related with voluntary carbon market called Carbon Biosol, and one of the mentors on the Carbon Nostrum project. Currently, he is developing a PhD project in NOVA University and teaching environmental and global change and in the same university. His work is focused on the use and management of soil to combat climate change and diversification in South Alentejo, Baixo Alentejo, in Portuguese, with a special focus on the soil carbon sequestration and the erosion process. In this webinar, we'll talk about a bit the work that he have been done in the have been done on carbon sequestration and ecosystem service on the left bank of the Guadiana, particularly in Serpa and Mertola. So Henrique, welcome and thank you so much to be with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everything's all right here technically. So the presentation I bring you today is about the ways in which carbon can be sequestered and provide ecosystem services in a very specific area on mainland Portugal. So we have areas that are traditionally more used for agricultural production and have a more productive historical background. And then in Portugal, and especially in mainland Portugal, near the border, we have areas that have poor soils and degraded lands by human management. So it's how we can use these mitigation and adaptation strategies to develop a sustainable development strategy or framework in which we can benefit the ecosystems, the income, and so on. So the discourse towards combating climate change has been defined by two distinct approaches. One is adapting to the consequences of a warmer and in some regions drier environments, and then mitigating the causes that trigger this warming. The strategies for climate change mitigation can be found either by reducing emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere or by attempting to reduce their atmospheric concentration. So there are many options, and we have been discussing them in prior presentations, both on the demand side, such as what we as consumers can influence through our consumption patterns and choices, and the demand side, which is what the broader systems value. In the sector that is most relevant to today's presentation, the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector, all options end up triggering different responses in various ecosystem services. So in the agriculture, forest, and other land use sector, perhaps the greatest carbon pools with one of the largest mitigation potentials is soil carbon. Soil carbon has been linked to all types of ecosystem services as it is most commonly associated with increasing organic matter, which in turn improves provisioning services by increasing fertility and agricultural productivity, regulating services by medium to long-term storage of carbon that once was in the atmosphere and improving water retention capacity, support systems by improving the ecosystem functions related to biodiversity, and cultural services by maintaining local species and livelihoods which are commonly associated with heritage, aesthetic values, and leisure activities such as tourism. So this is especially important in poor and degraded lands, where climate change and enhanced desertification play a role in triggering ever-increasing land degradation processes. In mainland Portugal, there is an increasing sensitivity to desertification, where a warmer and a drier climate meet naturally poor and artificially degraded lands. In the southern Alentejo and the Algarve, which is here, somewhere around here, this is especially relevant, as in the face of these changes, the ability to provide grass for pasture or feedstock and so on is severely hindered. And we can see for these pictures of grazing lands, which I've been showing you, in the left bank of the Guadiana River. However, there sometimes is a gap between local and regional environmental characteristics and the territorial policies that shape land use and land cover change. Here you can see for a municipality in the lower inner Alentejo, which is Mertola, that whilst decennial precipitation has been steadily decreasing since the 1940s, which is the data we have available from precipitation stations without putting ourselves into modeling, and the subsidy allocation since our inclusion in the common market. And this has triggered some land use change trajectories from what was already a somewhat intense activity linked to degradation processes in the last century, such as cereal production, and towards grazing land. What our research has found is that in these poor and degraded lands, and we'll see more of that later, these changes have triggered geomorphic processes that led to losses in soil organic matter, increased compaction, and a regressive ecological succession. This also means that carbon losses from the soil system to the atmosphere in the short term. So land change trajectories are complex and dynamic. They delve on four main pillars. First one is the environment, in which climate, soils, and geomorphology determine what types of land use can be done in a given place. Policy, where financial incentives as political frameworks based on regional, national, and internationally determined objectives ultimately guide land use and management possibilities. And culture, where habits, tradition, bias, and other very complex and site-specific realities shape what is done, how, and for what reason, and ultimately the socioeconomic context that shapes economic activity based on the availability of labor and income of whatever given territory. This year, this region that is highlighted here is the left bank of the Guadiana River. It is an area within the lower Alentejo where we do research and from which are the examples that I will be showing you next. So there are two main trajectories of change. On the one hand, we can shift from a land use or land cover situation to another that is more intense in resources and a higher load in the ecosystem. For example, when you shift from a traditional olive grove to a super intensive one. On the other hand, we can have an extensification. For example, when you have a shift from cropland to natural grassland or low density pasture. However, there are two main things to note here. The first one is that the meaning of intensification and extensification is also determined to the carrying capacity of a landscape. If I have a shallow and stony soils with low organic matter, the change from cropland to pasture can be an intensification if there are no environmental characteristics that allow that pasture to grow, and we end up having the degradation gradients triggered by trampling, soil compaction, and so on. So these land use and land cover characteristics have a meaning and a density in soil carbon stocks based on how the carbon cycle works between photosynthesis and the buildup of soil organic matter and its influence and also management practices in the texture and bulk density, which is what ultimately allows us to calculate the density of carbon in a given area. What we have here in these maps is, on the one hand, an estimate of soil organic carbon in the left bank of the Guadiana River for the year 2018, based on the characteristics of soil and land use and land cover for that year. On the right, what we have is soil carbon sinks and sources based on land use change between 1995 and 2018. Where it's green, we have a plot of land that improved carbon stock and provided the carbon removal from the atmosphere and stored it into the soil. And where it's red, we have a land use trajectory between a class that has a higher soil carbon stock and the one that has a lower one. The starkest example, and just theoretically explaining this, would be if we have an area of spontaneous vegetation that was cleared for wheat production, we have a soil carbon loss due to lower organic matter input and higher erosional activity, which trigger carbon losses from the soil system. So these differences are based on the organic matter density for different types of land uses. Here in this graph, we have soil organic matter percent for different types of land use and land cover classes in the Serra de Serpa and Mertla, which is a landscape unit within this area. It's somewhere around here, but we'll talk about this later. As you can see, there are stark differences between cereal production and spontaneous vegetation. How this will then translate to soil carbon will then be determined by the influence of each of these land use and land cover situations into soil bulk density, as soil organic matter is ultimately a volumetric estimate. So going back to this change map, we can see that even within the same region, within a region, so we have the left bank of the Guadiana within the lower Alentejo, there are stark contrasts which are most likely determined by soil type and geomorphology. In the deeper, I'll try to point here, in the deeper and richer soils in Serpa and Moura, we have a tendency towards intensification, especially towards super intensive olive groves. In the Mertula fields, which is this area here in the south, where soils are shallow and poor, but with a history of agricultural use, and discussing why this happens would be for another day, there is little to no change, and the change that exists is towards some type of extensification from agriculture to pasture land. And last, but definitely not least, we have the Serra and the Barrancos area, which is, the Serra especially, is perhaps the area with the poorest soils, which is similar to Barrancos, but we have a complex intricacy between clearing areas that were not utilized for a long time towards creating agroforestry systems and abandoning those agroforestry systems. So why this division happens is another complex discussion, but for now we'll focus on these greenish transitions you can see here. Yeah. which can be translated somewhat to agricultural land abandonment or simply the cessation of agricultural activity. So I will show you now the landscape. This is the Serra, and it's undulating terrain that is characteristic of this Devonian schist landscape, resulting in very shallow soils. We're talking about 10 to 15 centimeters, very low organic matter content, very high bulk density, and very intense erosional processes whenever vegetation is disturbed. However, this has not always been the case. Due to poor environmental characteristics, this area was barely touched by humans until the early 20th century. These were common lands where people extracted shrubland wood for fuel and had bees for honey and wax production. It was all 100% spontaneous vegetation. It was a forest on its own. Well, this changed when the commons were privatized in the early 20th century and cereal production was incentivized. So now we have to imagine that this area that was all spontaneous vegetation and a somewhat lush shrubland completely transformed itself and now became completely bare. So this was the situation in the 1930s. So over the last 100 years, what we've been observing is the evolution of a totally human-induced landscape. And here we have some pictures from 1930s and pictures taken in the exact same place in this year, basically. So you can see it's the house which was here being constructed. It's now here. Everything was bare, and now the landscape has evolved a bit. You can see the same example here. So what is agricultural land abandonment? It's a very interesting phenomenon that occurs due to a mix of environmental and socioeconomic factors. It's one of the main land use and land cover change transitions in Europe in the last couple of years, and it happens in marginal areas where productivity, income, and active population decrease. For example, it's widely studied subject in the mountain areas of the Pyrenees where people have been leaving the area and they were mainly pasture areas, and now pasture land has not been used for pasture, vegetation has been succeeding, and so on. So when there is a cessation of agricultural activity, we have three main things happening. The first one is the increase in primary productivity. As ecological succession evolves from small annual plants to large perennials, the carbon uptake per unit of area also increases. We'll see examples of this in a moment. This has an impact on carbon sequestration in the biomass, as well as improving biodiversity. The second one is a reduction in erosional and hydrological processes almost immediately after human activity stops. We're talking about 1 to 3 years, which leads to a decrease in land degradation and an impulse towards ecosystem recovery. Then we have an increase in soil organic matter, as there is more organic material from these new plants deposited in the ground due to vegetation recovery and lower erosional activity, which would wash it away, leading to soil carbon sequestration. All these results in improving ecosystem services, which could be valued in a payment for ecosystem services approach in this area, such as the ones that my colleagues have been discussing earlier. So instead of valuing productive areas in this very marginal land where land degradation occurs, we perhaps should think of valuing the different types of ecosystem services that these lands may also provide beyond the provision of feedstock and materials. So in this slide, you can see the vegetation dynamics between land use transitions as well as some management practices. So when we have pasture land, we have a somewhat steady vegetation activity because the animals eat the grasses and it becomes stable over time. However, when land is plowed, we have not only the removal of some vegetation, but also a triggering in soil degradation processes that hinder vegetation growth and limits carbon capture capacity. How to manage this with current legislation and fire control measures is something very interesting to be discussed. However, when we have agricultural land abandonment, the secondary succession that follows quickly develops higher and more complex vegetation structure and dynamics. How this vegetation evolves over time is determined not only by the soil, climate, and geomorphology of the site, but also from the starting point and historical degradation due to human activity. So we studied this using the plots from the Val Formoso Soil Erosion Experimental Center. So from 1961 to 2008, this center had 15 plus plots which were managed according to the land use and management practices relevant to this area. So we have cereal, different types of fallow and ploughing techniques, pasture and legume rotations, etc. But due to technical constraints, agricultural activity in each plot has stopped in 2018, and 2 plots were last managed in 2015. This allowed us to start studying ecological succession, biodiversity, and carbon sequestration in the soils and biomass based on the time after agricultural land abandonment, as well as the starting point and how degraded the area was in the beginning of the succession. So as vegetation grows, we have improvements in water retention capacity, soil organic matter, and aggregate stability, which not only mean a mitigation potential due to the ability to remove and store these atmospheric greenhouse gases, but also provides adaptation capacity in a scenario of drought, for example. In these slides, we have side by side 2 plots that between 1961 and 2008 had exactly the same management style. So it was a permanent rotation of 1 year with cereal, 1 year fallow with the soil bare, and it was tilled. So in 2008, this activity stopped, and T1, which is here on the left, had cereal cover, and T2 was having the soil tilled and exposed. What happened next is an ecological succession at 2 rhythms, with T1 being colonized with species indicative of better soil conditions, such as Gramineae, and the second one being colonized with shrub species that value poorer and stonier soils, such as Lavandula louisieri, rosemary. Here we have a detail on the evolution of plot number 2, that one that was left plowed, which was abandoned as depicted on the left side, and has been left evolving ever since. So we have this ecosystem recovery, and we study the number of species that are appearing, the soil organic matter across the gradient, and now we are also measuring biomass with photogrammetry and 3D analysis. In this example, I bring you again the same plot, plot number 2, and plot 7x. Plot 7x was planted with Cistus ladanifer esteva, in Portuguese, since 1989. I can tell you that right now, the plot on the right is, among all the 18 plots, the one with higher soil organic carbon, even though we still have to calibrate the results for biomass carbon, as in this regards, there was a big change between the starting point and today. And the big change was that the types of species that we have planted here in 2016 have fulfilled their potential and have fulfilled their role in the ecosystem recovery and have completely left the plot. So the plot's limits are here. What we are seeing here is the Cistus ladanifer species all within the plot, and now they're all left since the soil conditions improved greatly. And now the type of species that are growing are also indicative, like in plot 1, of better environmental conditions. So then we found some interesting results after a sequence of drought years that indicate that perhaps this situation is not as stable as we may think. But we need to study it further in the near future, and maybe in a few months we'll have some more insights about this. And maybe to finish this off, this is preliminary data on soil organic carbon sequestration after the cessation of agricultural activity based on the years without agricultural activity. So to achieve this result, we employed not only the erosion plots, which have been abandoned, which have abandonment records for 8 years, 15 years, 23 and 38 years, as well as sites that we knew from historical documents, oral aerial photography, such as the Royal Air Force flight from 1947, and satellite imagery that we knew that were abandoned or without human intervention for a very long period of time. This also allows, so this is what I meant before for the possibility of having improved carbon uptake from these types of ecosystems and the valuation that they have in cultural, regulating and support ecosystem services, and what this can mean in a payment for service mechanism. So in conclusion, what can we take away from this? Firstly, land use and land cover change trajectories trigger different carbon flows between land systems and the atmosphere. Then intensification, extensification, or the abandonment of agricultural activity has varying effects depending on the environmental conditions. Site-specific planning and management is important for net negative emission scenarios. And then in marginal areas, marginal areas which are poor and degraded soils, this payment for ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration in soils and biomass is fundamental to maintain income while reverting land degradation gradients and improving territorial resilience in a climate change scenario. So that's what I had for you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henrique. Very excellent presentation about in this specific area. Congratulations. And for me, it's inspiring to have that the ecosystem services in these areas still working on the and recovering these areas. And my question is quite related on that. There is an opportunity to use your approach, for example, for the different areas in Portugal or in Europe regarding the trajectory of change. So exploring the intensification, extensification or abundant. So what are the parameters or the requirements to go forward in one of these cases? So because I'm thinking in the different marginal lands that we can explore, if there are no suitable for agricultural practices, for example, but we can have profit on that, and recover, for example, in the areas around. So create this kind of support for the agriculture in that area. So the question is how we can explore this trajectory. So identifying if we go to the intensification, abandonment, or extensification, what are the parameters to go forward to the next to the different areas?
So I guess the idea here is having two rhythms. So the first one is understanding how territories change over time and how that change is related to the natural characteristics of a site and how people using that land and using those natural resources, how it's linked to the carrying capacity of a specific site. And then whenever there is a discrepancy between the carrying capacity, the environmental performance, and ultimately, for example, the agricultural yield or the amount of pasture that we can grow, and if there is like a discrepancy between what people, farmers want or they expect from a given plot of land and what the ecosystem actually gives them, if there's a scission between that, we have the ability or we have an opportunity to seize this human intervention and provide these different types of ecosystem services of secondary succession. So the idea here is we know that we have to produce food, and we know that people want and need to have income in these areas. So what type of income can be done and what kind of interventions? They can be natural, they can be supervised, they can be there's various degrees of human intervention in these types of recovery, and we've also been trying different ones. Today I brought you 2 to 3 plots, but we have 18 different ones. And to manage this, to have these marginal areas, instead of being net emitters of greenhouse gases and net producers of land degradation gradients, make them being part of the solution, both capturing carbon from the atmosphere, improving biodiversity, improving water retention capacity, and so on. So it's these two rhythms. First, study the territory, its culture, its land use change, then study the environmental aspects, and then trying to think about how to put the payment for ecosystem services and this ecosystem service valuation in the hands of the people that live in the land.
Yeah, of course. So you are saying that, yeah, we have to collect or make together in the table the stakeholders, municipalities, all of them, and create what we intend for the landscape and in the specific areas with a specific challenge, of course. Also in the chat, yeah, Henrique, do you have now a challenge? Henrique, do you want to do the study in the Litoral Alentejo? Alentejano, a question
I do because the climate's better than where I study.
Maybe it's a very interesting study, so maybe you can speak with Susanna. And this one, what's your opinion about our politics that require landowners to get the shrubs like CICS.NOVA?
I mean, I can only speak for the areas where I study, which is that left bank of the Guadiana River. And whenever we have people that, due to those policy interventions, need to clear the shrublands, what we have almost immediately when it rains is very intense erosional processes, which ultimately degrade the land very much. And I can tell you that the deepest gullies and the places with lowest organic matter content, lowest water retention capacity, and higher compaction rates are in places where the shrublands have been taken away and cattle has been going after that. So I understand the need to manage these shrublands due to fire risk and so on, but I believe that there should be and there needs to be this discussion, because these species have a very important role in the ecosystem, and when they aren't there, they actually degrade the land. So we need to have a management that, yes, it hinders fire risk, but it should not degrade soils in areas that are already poor and are already degraded.
Yeah. Okay, Henrique, thank you so much again for your presentation and your data. Maybe we have time, we have 2 minutes to 3 minutes, and I would like to come back to our other speakers, Mathieu and Henrique. Just a very quick question, and I would like to have a very small answer. What are your opinion about the carbon farming and the impact, the real impact that will be in the next 5 years? You can start with Henrique.
So what's the importance of the carbon market?
The carbon farming and the carbon credits and for the farmers in the next 5 years? And
yeah, I must tell you that's a theme that I've been following closely since 2019. And in the last 5 years, at least here in Portugal, the discussion has been somewhat slowish, but I think it's complementary to emission reductions, and especially in these marginal areas. And I will always be a partisan of these poor and marginal areas due to the places I study. It could be a very important way of valuing income and valuing ecosystem recovery efforts of people in these areas, while still providing them with a means of subsistency in these areas.
Yeah, additional support.
Yeah.
And Matthew, what's your opinion? That's maybe in Europe, but also in the rest of the world, of course.
Well, my focus is mostly on Europe now, so I'll speak for Europe, and I think I'll have to echo a bit of the critical view that I presented earlier. 100% all for nature restoration, ecosystem restoration, the right incentives to do so, and a transition to a sustainable food system. Yes, carbon farming there can have a role. I do worry that in its current shape and form and what it's looking like from a policy angle now, that it risks being too narrow, not going far enough. And I think the main consideration there is, will it in its current form be able to drive and fund this really quite drastic transition that we need, and will it be able to do so in a way that is holistic enough and addresses not only emissions but also our biodiversity crisis, and make the sector more resilient for the future. So I do see a role for it, but I'm a bit worried about the centrality it gets, and maybe that it displaces other really important actions that should be taken, such as a reform of the whole agricultural policy in Europe.
Yeah, of course, and also the standards that are behind of all of this, of course. And Andrew, to you.
Yeah, very quickly, conscious of time.
Yeah.
I think we need to be careful about answering a question like that as if carbon farming is all in one direction and all in one market. I think there's the offset voluntary carbon market interpretation, which I think we all share a lot of similar kind of concerns and judgments. My experience is more within the value chain, so working with the food and beverage companies. And one of the things that's interesting there is that the interest of that sector, of those companies, is not just carbon. It's actually about the broader agroecological health of the farming systems that they depend on: water, soil health, and ultimately crop resilience. And so what we're seeing is a very natural expansion of interest from carbon, where we started quantification and monetization, into soil health and water, and more value flowing. So I just think, carbon farming, it's easy to talk about, but let's just be careful to be nuanced about where we think the financial incentive is coming from, because that can bring more natural alignment with some of our concerns or not, that we've talked about today.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And also give all the information and to the farmers, to and also the stakeholders in the whole value chain, in the agri-food value chain, to make them responsible and more value for this kind of carbon. So once again, thank you so much, Henrique, Matthew, Andrew, for the availability to be in this webinar, for your presentations. I think we are in the final, but besides, I'd like to move to finish with this webinar, this cycle of webinar. I invited you to go to our website, where we have our last webinars focus on the water management, functional biodiversity, precision agriculture, and also this one, the carbon sequestration. Thank you so much, all the speakers in all webinar cycles. And in particular, it was a pleasure for me to be with Andrew, Matthew, and Henrique, and share all this information. Thank you so much again. And before you go, I would like to, if you want to continue to learning about these issues, please join us in the second edition of Healthy Soils for Life Summer School. It is opportunity to integrate the entrepreneurship training in food production innovation that will enable you to create solutions to the global challenge. We can develop your knowledge in soil health, soil microbiology, eco-friendly, sustainable farming practices, towards to the sustainable and climate farming agriculture. If you want to know more about the school, feel free to contact my colleague Rita or Claudia Costa, and you are all invited to go on this summer school. Thank you so much again, and see you in the next cycle, and we'll be in a near in the very short term. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone.